Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 10, verses 17 through 27. And the text for today says, Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel up out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now rejected your God who saves you out of all your disasters and calamities. And you have said, no, appoint a king over us. So now present yourselves before the Lord by tribes and clans. When Samuel had all Israel come forward by tribes, the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and Matri's clan was taken. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was taken. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he has hidden himself among the supplies. They ran and brought him out, and as he stood among the people, he was a head taller than any of the others. Samuel said to all the people, do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people. Then the people shouted, long live the king. Samuel explained to the people the rights and duties of kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Then Samuel dismissed the people to go to their homes. Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. But some scoundrels said, how can this fellow save us? They despised him and brought him no gifts, but Saul kept silent. So remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And number one says, what happened in our last few Bible studies? A, Samuel's sons didn't follow in his ways, so Israel asked Samuel to give them a king. That's true. B, God tells Samuel that they have rejected him and not Samuel. That's true. God tells Samuel to do what they want, but let them know what it is going to cost them, and that it wasn't his plan. His plan would have been better. That's true. D, Israel affirmed that they wanted a king anyway. That's true. And then E, Samuel anointed Saul. So this is where we've come in the last few chapters, the last few Bible studies, working our way to this. And that's good. Number two, what happens in 10:17 through 19? A, Samuel gets nicer and tells them they are right. We just keep expecting, especially since God seems to have a plan despite what they have done or said, despite the fact that they're asking for a king and denying him. He still seems to have a plan, and so it's easy for us to say, oh, okay, then God must have come to peace with this, and God is now all right with this. But when they show up at Mizpah, he says to them, remember, this is what the Lord says. Remember, I brought you out of Egypt and I delivered you from the power of the Egypt and all the kings that oppressed you, but you rejected. So let's just get straight what we're doing here. Let's just remember, lest we start to think that God has just gotten okay with your rebellion. Let's remember why you're here, and that is that you've rejected God. And so what we're doing here, let me just stand and say, Samuel, the man of God, as he is choosing God's appointed king, yet this was not God's plan. And remember that this means you have rejected God, that we're doing this. That's Samuel did not get nicer. Samuel did not tell them they're right. B, Samuel tells them the words of God, that he rescued them out of Egypt, and yet they have rejected him in favor of an earthly king. That's true. See, Samuel seems to be giving them one more chance to change their mind. God keeps pursuing us to try to warn us even after we've made decisions that are not his will. And I actually believe that that's true. Now, probably God, well, I know God knew this, and probably Samuel was aware too that they weren't going to listen to it anyway. But he takes one last chance, one last opportunity to say, this wasn't God's plan. And the fact that you're asking for a king, and here we are ready to give it to you, is that means that you've rejected God. And so he delivers God's words one more time. And God does continue to pursue us even after we've made wrong choices. God continues to try to get us to turn in the right direction. Number 3 says, have you ever pursued a path that you thought would be better for you and keep hearing the same message from God that seems like a warning? Have you ever done that? Now, maybe you say, no, I always follow God. I hope that's true, but probably you've not always followed God. But sometimes people come to church and they say they don't come to church very often, but when they do, they say, why is it that every time I come to church, the pastor's preaching about the same thing over and over? That's all pastors ever preach about. No, that's not all pastors ever preach about. But it is interesting that you've noticed that every time you show up, that God has a message for you. The pastor didn't know you were going to be there, but God knew you were going to be there. And so if every time you come to church, the pastor's preaching about the same thing, perhaps God is trying to speak to you about something, and you don't let him speak very often. You don't let him talk to you in your devotion time at home. You don't let him talk to you because about certain things. You only want to talk to God about other things. So when you finally do get to church and there's a person that's speaking the word of God, that person is speaking about something, and it's the same thing every time you go. That's not a coincidence. That's God orchestrating. That's God speaking to you. Because if you ask the people that are there every week, the pastor doesn't preach about that every week. In most cases, that's true. There's a few pastors that do preach about the same thing every week, but I think that's relatively rare. So if the pastor seems to be preaching about the same thing every time you show up, it's not because you showed up that the pastor decided to preach it. It's because you showed up that God had already prepared the pastor's heart and given him a message, and God knew you were going to be there, and that's the message God's still trying to speak. So Samuel just keeps bringing up the same message, another chance, another chance. The second part, did you wonder why he kept, and he meaning God, kept repeating himself? Did you ever wonder why God seems to keep giving you the same warning? Maybe you didn't realize you were off track at the time, or you were in denial that you were off track. But every time you show up in church, the same message comes, and you start to wonder, why is God repeating himself? Why does this keep happening? The next part says, did you finally listen? Well, maybe you finally responded, and that's why you're here in this Bible study today, and you're growing and you're learning, and you're being more and more what God has called you to be every day. You're being molded in his image. Or maybe today, again, God is speaking to, maybe that's what's happening right now, and God's speaking to you about that thing once again. What was the outcome? Maybe now you're right with the Lord. Maybe there was some pretty terrible consequences for not listening, or maybe the outcome is yet to be decided, because even today you have a chance, you have a choice. Number 4, what happened in verses 20 through 22? 20 through 22 says, when Samuel had all Israel come forward by tribes of Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin clan by clan, and Matri's clan was taken. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was taken. They narrowed down the people from tribes to clans to families to Saul. That's true. And they did it by casting lots, by the way. So isn't it interesting? Casting lots is sort of a form of, I don't want to say this because in Nazarene circles, this is bad news to say this, but it was a sort of a form of lottery or chance. But they believed that God guided, it wasn't chance because God was guiding it. And so it was a way that God would confirm his will, and it wasn't humans influencing his will because they would cast lots, and then the lot that was chosen would be uh, believed to be God's will. And if that, like in this case, confirms the thing that God had already said to Samuel, then how much more was it confirmation that God was involved? And so that's what happened. So Samuel didn't show up and say, God spoke to me. I've already anointed Saul. Saul's the king. Samuel showed up and says, okay, we are going to roll the dice, and we're going to, it wasn't a lottery because nobody bought into it, by the way, just so you, those Nazarenes that are freaking out right now, it wasn't the kind of lottery that we oppose, because it wasn't about paying money into something to try to win something at a very low odds wager. It wasn't that, but they were drawing straws. For instance, they were rolling dice, and this tribe was chosen, and this clan was chosen, and this family was chosen, and now this person from this family was chosen, and ultimately it was Saul. And um, Saul B says they couldn't find Saul. Saul wasn't there. When they looked for him, he was not to be found, was what verse 21 says. And then C, when people started to look for him, somebody sold him out. He was hiding among the supplies. Well, no, yes and no. Somebody didn't sell him out. They inquired further of the Lord, and they said, has Saul come here yet? God, you've chosen Saul, but he's not even here. How does that happen? Has he not come? And the Lord replied, yes, he is hidden among the supplies. And then they ran to find him and brought him out. And so it was actually God who sold him out. God found him. God knew where he was. Isn't it interesting that they couldn't find Saul, but God knew exactly where he was? Saul was running from the plan that God had from him, but God knew where he was. Has this ever happened? Well, yeah. I mean, Jonah, God chased Jonah down. God got Jonah where, that's the famous story that we know through scripture. Even kids know that because that's a good flannel graph story. But God knew exactly where he was, and God found him. And by the way, if God has a plan for you, and God has a call on your life, and you think you're hiding or running away and you're going to get away from it, he knows where you are, and he's still looking for you. And if you're the one he's chosen, he's going to tell people about you, and they're going to come finding you, and they're going to find where you are. You can't get away from the call of God and from his plan. I'm living proof of that. You can run, but you can't hide. And he knows where you are. He will find you. That sounds really creepy, like some kind of a horror film, but that's not what we're talking about. This is God. He knows where you are, and he can tell people where you are, and he's going to track you down. He's going to find you because he has a plan for your life that you're running from. Number 5, how do you respond when you are chosen by God for a purpose in his kingdom? How do you respond? Do you respond like Saul did? I'd love to say, no, yeah, I'm always available for God's call and for God's plan. And I hope that that's true today. But I can just tell you that in my life, I was the guy that would have easily been hiding among the supplies or anywhere else but where he wanted me to be. And a lot of us have run from the call of God and from his purpose for our lives. And many people in ministry have a story of how they didn't want to do what God called them to do, and it seemed too big, it seemed too scary, it didn't seem fun, it didn't seem easy, and so they didn't want to do it. And the only question really is not so much have we ever ran, but most of the time it's how far did you run before you let God catch you. um, how far did you have to get? For some people, we didn't want to, and that meant a long-term time of prayer. And finally, we surrendered to God, and we didn't really run or go anywhere. But we spent a lot of time in prayer, begging God to say that this isn't really what I want for you. But for too many of us, it was years and lots of sin and going our own way before we realized that we just couldn't get away from him. So number 6 says, which is worse, to eat up the attention or to hide? So this is always an interesting thing. I would say neither is worse, because both are bad. And both are not doing God's will and recognizing him for it. However, I would argue that pastors who jumped at the chance to be the center of attention and were not afraid and did not sort of respect the role and the call and did not fear God enough to realize the weight of it, I do think that's worse. Honestly, I would rather a pastor or a leader, or whatever the call is, whatever God's called you to do in your life, I would rather us recognize the weight of it, respect God enough to not jump into it just without having thought about it, but to have at least considered how big a task it was, so that when we do choose to enter into it, we enter into it with a sense of awe and respect for God, than somebody who chooses ministry, perhaps even when God did not choose them, chooses some kind of supposed call of God because it puts them at the center of attention, instead of because God has actually called. So man, I don't know, neither is good. But honestly, I don't think it's good to run from God. But if we respect the weight of the call enough to count the cost before we enter into it, I think that's a good thing. There's a fine line between that and running for a time. And I would rather us fault on the side of respecting the weight of the call, and taking it seriously. And then, of course, I would say, let's not run, but let's take it seriously and then choose to do it anyway. So I do think in the end, faulting on either side is not good. But I would rather somebody respect the weight of the task and take it seriously and not use it. So the false teachers that we've been learning about, if you're with us at the same time here in our church, we've been studying in 2 Peter, and the false teachers that he talks about there were in it for their own gain. And so that's a very scary place to be also. Number 7, what do verses 23 and 24 tell us about Saul? he was a head taller than any of the others. He was impressive. So regardless of him being from the least of the tribes and the least of the clans and families and all of that, yet he was an impressive person. Physically, we've already learned that he was handsome, and now we learn that he's a head taller. And Samuel says, you see the type of guy. Isn't this the type of guy that God would have chosen? Somebody that's easy to follow. He's huge, he's handsome, and he's going to lead us forward. I don't know if you're aware, but statistically, the presidents of the United States are quite a bit taller than the average American. Um, I think most of them. I think there's only been about two in the history of the United States presidents that were under 6 foot. You can go back and fact check that and get the exact statistics, but it's not uncommon for them to be 6 foot, 6'2". Even I think some have been as tall as 6'6", and so why? Well, I would say the media age where you can film a movie where Sylvester Stallone looks like a big, tall, huge person when he's really very short. In this media age, you can probably fake it. But if anybody sees people in person, we have a tendency to believe that somebody who's taller and more imposing and more impressive physically is more capable. That may or may not be true, but that's what we think. Very few presidents have been overweight. It's just hard to get elected that way, I think, or at least terribly overweight. Anyway, so he looked impressive. He looked like a king. He looked like a leader. Number 8, was everybody excited about Saul being, I think I'm missing a word there, about Saul being king, the new king, according to verse 27. So a lot of people were. There were people that went home with Saul and devoted themselves to protecting him and serving him. But in verse 27, it says, some scoundrels said, how can this fellow save us? So no, everybody wasn't excited. So the last part says, do you think there will ever be a leader that everybody agrees with? That's something to think about here. This was God's appointed leader, but some people loved him. Some people said, yes, wonderful. We're caught up in the excitement. God has chosen this person. And some people said, he's not going to save us. And that's always true. There's always going to be doubters. There's always going to be people that question a leader. In ministry, it's really common to in the Church of the Nazarene, we vote, have a congregational vote for our pastors. And I don't know whether it's a pastor or a district superintendent. I don't know that I've ever seen a 100% vote. I think there's always people around the congregation that think there shouldn't be a 100% vote, that somebody's got to be the check on the wave of emotion that everybody's riding. But when we announced that Larry Lasher was going to be on the ballot for our district superintendent, he got a standing ovation when we announced the name. That's how popular he was in terms of people feeling like this was the right choice for a leader. This was the person that was from our district. This is somebody who understood our district, grew up on our district. This is somebody who, by the way, is also tall. This is somebody who is smart. This is somebody who is diplomatic when it comes to getting the right thing done, but loving people in the process, and not not criticizing or belittling or making people feel bad if they don't agree at first. And yet he didn't get 100% vote. I didn't get 100% vote when I was elected to be the pastor of our church. So nobody's going to get 100% vote. There are going to be people that are critical. There are going to be people that don't think that we know what we're doing, or that we're the kind of people that can get the job done. And sometimes they may be right. And sometimes we'll win people over by our leadership, and people will come to agree with us. But in the process of winning a few people over, we'll have probably made a few people think that we're an idiot, and they'll be the 2 or 3 no votes. Or a lot of pastors won't come and become the pastor of a church if they don't have a high 90s vote, because the number of people that they're going to have to win over from the beginning, if there's that many people that don't think that they're, I think it only has to be, I'm just from memory, I don't have my manual in front of me, but I think it only has to be a 2/3 vote. But I don't know, most pastors would not come on an 80% vote. They would want at least 90 or 95% vote to come, because you already got 20% of the people that don't think you should be the pastor. And so anyway, that's just a little bit of insight into Nazarene polity and how we do things in terms of a congregation calling its pastor. But in the end, you're always going to have people. If you're a leader, you're going to have people that don't agree. You're going to have a people that don't think you're capable. And I'm not, I have a lot of people, I think, in our church that love me. But if I went to a vote today, I would not have 100% vote. I'm quite confident. And that's the way it is. And at some point, we've got to decide that we're going to do what God tells us to, whether people like it or whether they don't. And we'll love people and we'll care for people and try to bring them along. But if there's people that are not going to like us, and some people are going to be mean. I had people tell me as the assistant pastor that come out of a Bible study class, and they said, our Bible study took a vote, and we are going to buy you a new shirt because you wear that one every week. I mean, that's just mean. I mean, there's no reason for it. And maybe they thought they were joking. I don't know. But why do we criticize people's dress and their physical appearance? And I had somebody say when my wife got pregnant that they didn't know if she was pregnant or if it was me. And people are just mean. And they don't, and they think, and when you're a leader, they think they can be mean, and you're not a person, and it doesn't affect you. And that is evidenced by the things that people say about our presidents, no matter what president it is. And I just, there are scoundrels, and there are doubters, and there are people that just will never like you. And so then the question is, are you going to let that stop you, or are you going to do what God has called you to do no matter what? And I can tell you that in my ministry, those things that I've heard, those critics and those questioners have hurt me. I don't have a high self-confidence. I may portray it differently, but I have a lot of insecurity. I don't have a high self-confidence of myself. And I question myself a lot. And the only reason I ever seem like I have any kind of confidence at all is because God's given me confidence that I never had before. And that would go away immediately if I thought that I wasn't in right relationship with God, and that confidence was misplaced, because that's the only thing that gives me that confidence. So I can just tell you that there are days that I was ready to quit, and the reason I was ready to quit was because one staff member criticized me, because one staff member said that, you don't mentor me right, or you don't do this right, or I don't like the way you do that. And just ready to quit. If my staff's not on board, how can I lead anything? um and at some point we go back to God and we decide that, no, God didn't tell me to do this as long as everybody agreed with me. He called me to do this, period. And anyway, so Saul had people that followed him home, valiant men whose hearts God had touched, and they were supporters of him. And Saul had people that didn't agree with him and despised him and didn't bring gifts to him. And yet he was the one that God had chosen. Um, so anyway, very interesting. I think it's good to be the kind of person that takes seriously the role that God has. If you don't, then you will certainly quit when it comes time, when you start realizing the doubters. Um, so take it seriously. Don't let it go to your head, but God has called you to something. And if he's called you, he's not going to stop pursuing you until you accept, until you surrender.